Hello, everyone. I'm Janet Salmons, Methods Guru for Sage MethodSpace, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Trena Paulus and Jessica Lester. And we're going to have a conversation about doing qualitative research in the digital world. But before we get started, if you are new to MethodSpace, this is a blog community sponsored by Sage Publications. With open access resources, original posts, interviews like this, and links to all kinds of resources about designing, conducting, analyzing all the different stages of doing research, then writing about it or sharing results in new and creative ways. And as you can see, at the heart of it is teaching and learning, because we're interested in helping to support faculty who are teaching methods or supervising researchers, and students and novice researchers, or maybe even experienced researchers who want to try something new. So we hope you'll visit us at methodspace.com. So Trena and Jessica, why don't you introduce yourselves?
Sure. So I am here in Johnson City, Tennessee. I'm a professor at East Tennessee State University. I'm housed in the research division of family medicine and helping support both researchers in the medical school and across campus in research design and methods. So that's where I'm coming from today.
And I am at Indiana University in Bloomington, and I'm in an inquiry methodology program. It's a research methodology program, and specifically I engage in graduate level teaching around qualitative methodologies and methods, as well as more specific courses related to digital tools and conversation analysis and discourse analysis.
All right, great. So you have a new edition coming out that is it has a new title, and we're excited to see this available in December. So, why is it important that you offer this book now?
Yeah, I'll jump in with this question. I think perhaps answering this question, it's helpful to contextualize a little bit about how we came to writing the book, and just give a story of the coming to telling this story within the book. So first off, about 4.5 years ago, we began exploring developing a second edition. And at the time, I was working with Sage US and generating some other texts for them. And I had a really great experience with an editor there. And we met with them and began exploring the possibility of transitioning our book to Sage US. At the same time, our co-author, Paul Dempster, who was a UK-based academic, decided to transition out of academia completely and wasn't really engaged in digital tools any longer. And so we saw the possibility of really rethinking the book itself. Alongside this, of course, we were both teaching methods courses, and in so doing, we began to see how there was the potential to really develop our book further as being a more comprehensive companion for introductory qualitative research courses and more advanced courses as well. And so we decided to write a second edition, but it's not a real second edition. It's a really fully revamped textbook that really is offering some rethinking on how to engage in generating a digital workflow. And in addition to that, just as we were finishing literally the last paragraphs of the book, we in the United States went into lockdown as the COVID pandemic became part of our everyday lives. And as pretty much all qualitative researchers now know across the world, COVID has really pushed us to all really think more deeply about what it means to do qualitative research, not just with using digital tools, but engaging in digital spaces. And that's certainly one of the core considerations within our text. So there's a historical moment that is also making, we feel, our book kind of the right time. Trena, do you want to offer a little bit more around digital spaces and digital tools in the book?
Yeah, I think You know, after we wrote the first edition and really focused on the idea of digital tools across the research process, we realized that tools was not the right word to capture sort of both the researcher tools like tape recorders, qualitative data analysis software, researcher
Mm-hmm.
intervention type tools, but the digital spaces, the internet, online communities was a huge player in terms of the sources of data part of the
Mm-hmm.
context of a research study. And so that's kind of why we felt like we needed to rework the title a little bit to focus on everything about the workflow being part of this sort of new digital world.
So could you kind of differentiate your terminology for digital tools versus and digital settings for those who are new to this?
Yes, and I'd like to show at this point, have you show the slide. So we were somewhat interested in expanding and contrasting and developing this book as a companion to other books similar to your book, Janet, on doing qualitative research online, because we thought in the first edition, we actually called it, we distinguished between researcher generated data and naturally occurring data.
Mm-hmm.
And we really just focused on that distinction in terms of types of data. And then we
Mm-hmm.
realized that that distinction was actually broader than just the types of data. It was
Mm-hmm.
digital tools that researchers used,
Mm-hmm.
and digital spaces were sort of the naturally occurring pre-existing data that was already there, whether the researcher is or not. And
Mm-hmm.
so we were kind of theorizing and thinking of that and comparing and contrasting it to your idea of the enacted, elicited, and extant data as ways to kind of
Mm-hmm.
conceptualize entering the digital world.
Right, and so yes, I also have doing qualitative research online, and a new edition is in the works. Will be out in the next year, and we really see these as companion books because they kind of cover different angles, and as you mentioned, I mean, one of the the couple of kind of distinctions that I offer in this book, one is distinguishing between um, extant data that would be what as you say, what's out there, whether we're there as researchers or not. But it's not only in online communities and social media and things like that. It's also archives and documents and diaries and films and photographs and all kinds of material that's available to us now. And when I was a master's student, I did archival research in a research center, with the people with white gloves bringing up the documents. And actually, you still need to do that in some, not everything is available digitally, but certainly, lots and lots of stuff is. That, differentiating that between then the next level being the extant, I mean, the elicited data collection, where we're asking a question or prompting in some way. So interviews, focus groups, other kinds of interactions. And then the third type, which I called enacted, mainly because I was trying to think of three things that started with E, but where, or some people might call performative, but here I just, in looking at the literature and the kinds of things that researchers are doing today, it seemed to me that you needed something beyond the question and answer prompting, where it's creative methods, arts-based methods, simulations, games, field experiments, all kinds of, much deeper interactive things where, there's a larger commitment on the part of both the researcher and the participant, and also more collaborative. And so, there's that distinction. The other one I want to just put out there, and then we can, just, talk about a little bit, is that, when I talk about with people in my book around the design decisions that you have to make, and what is the role of technology in the study. So again, I have another three-stage kind of thought process. One is that sometimes technology is a medium. Like right now, Zoom is our medium for having this communication, and we're not concerned with that technology itself, but the fact that it allows us to communicate. So as a researcher, if I'm using a medium, I'm not really studying anything necessarily. I could be studying anything, doesn't have to do with technology, but I need some way of communicating with my participants. And by doing it online or electronically with other kinds of digital apps and things like that, then I have a chance to expand the pool of people I might communicate with. They don't have to just be in my own community. And these days, even if they aren't in your own community, you still can't see them face to face. So, we're looking for something that the participants are comfortable with and have access to. Then the next level is the setting. And that would be, where I'm choosing the technology because it has particular features. Like, we are in this technology because we want to be able to show the visuals on the slides as well as the camera. So we're choosing this technology because it has specific features that will allow us, if we were collecting data, to collect the kinds of data that we would want to collect. If we were doing interview in this kind of setting, you could see we could have visual data, oral data. We could be typing in the chat area and have written data, so there are all kinds of, things that we would choose that tool, for that strategic purpose. Or it could be that we choose to do participant observation or to collect other kinds of data in an online community because this is where parents are talking about school or where employees are talking about flex time or whatever it is we're studying. So we choose that setting, for that strategic way. But the technology is still kind of the in aid of the research. But in the third category where the technology is the phenomenon, in that case, I'm studying how does Zoom work? How does Adobe Connect or social media sites, how do these work? How do people, what are people doing on them? What are the features? How are they used? So I'm, kind of would be more in the category what I would call internet studies, where, you're really studying the technology. So I just throw that out for your response of how that intersects with what you're talking about in your book.
Yeah, Jessica, I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about how we really did have to, the reason why and how we did kind of rethink how we were defining technology and the role of technology.
Yeah, so I think, much of what you shared, Janet, I know that we point to your work in our book as, some of the key questions that you just posed and the strategic models that you offer as ways to help make decisions. And one of the things that we then also layer across the book is really approaching digital tools and digital spaces first and foremost from a theorizing perspective rather than a neutralizing perspective. And so I'll just back up and say a little bit about how we came to that point. So after we wrote our first book, I remember texting Trena and saying, I found a critique of our book. And so we came across Adams and Thompson, who we're going to talk about their book a little bit later, offered a really incisive critique of the way that we took up digital tools and the digital tools for qualitative research, our first book, and highlighted how in many cases implicitly we were assuming that tools were just tools, that they were neutral actors that weren't really entangled with us in our social science activity. And these authors take a more post-qualitative new materialist perspective, wherein many of those scholars have written about and argued the idea that technologies are always already entangled with our social science activity. So several years ago, we began kind of sitting with that critique. And as we thought about writing a new book, one of the things that we really wanted to do was engage more deeply with theories of technology. In our first book, we do talk about the affordances theory, but we wanted to think with that, but also beyond that. And so one of the things that we do in the book is that we encourage qualitative researchers to begin their exploration of digital tools and digital spaces with theorizing. That the first step before you even design your study is to engage in theorizing the nature of digital tools, with the idea being, and we argue this throughout, that we are always entangled with the tools. And we don't argue for a deterministic orientation, wherein like tools are determining what actually happens in the study, but we do weave throughout each of the chapters consideration through reflective questions, as well as some of the vignettes, which we'll talk about in a little bit, wherein we invite readers to really think about how we can theorize the digital, so to speak.
Right. So in your discussion about tools and spaces and settings not being neutral, do you talk about kind of the commercial nature and, increasingly commercial nature of the tools that we use?
Yeah, what we have intentionally tried to do both in the previous edition and this book is offer a variety of choices to, like you were saying, Janet, the specific tool, brand name of the tool doesn't always matter. It's what it's what you want to accomplish with it. So we try to offer options, everything from open source, free, to proprietary. And this is, of course, with the terms of the commercial nature of the tools, I think we see that the most with the qualitative data analysis software world, that it is really, a lot of these packages are not affordable. In fact, I was just having a conversation yesterday with some colleagues that, for a 5-person license of some of these big packages, it's $5,000, and it's in some, so it's not affordable. And so we do kind of talk about that in terms of, here are some of the trade-offs of what you do get for that $5,000 is better customer service and support than you're going to get with open source free tools, where you kind of have to know a little bit of programming, and the fact that there are often trial versions that you can get for free. If you're students, you're going to get, and this goes for everything from citation management software to transcription software to QDA software. But yes, that aspect of neutrality and power and equity is a very important one. And we really tried to build that issue into the reflection questions as well at the end of each chapter, so that people are kind of consciously aware of those decisions that they're making.
I think that will be, really valuable for students, especially who kind of take online spaces that they participate in kind of for granted as just being almost like a utility, but they're not, they're there to make money. So helping them to think through what those questions of neutrality and non-neutrality might be as they are selecting the kinds of things that they want to use, would be very helpful, I think. So in this book, you have a series of vignettes. So could you talk about how, how you use those and how readers might learn from these vignettes?
Yeah, we really enjoyed working with the vignette writers in the first edition. So we knew we wanted to keep vignettes as sort of a central masterpiece of each chapter, a central focal point, I guess I should say. Methodology can be abstract, and people often have a preconceived notion of what a certain technology tool is. And so we wanted to include anecdotes, actual stories from researchers that are methodologically driven, but show these unique digital workflows that researchers are creating all the time, and give some researchers the space to actually reflect on and tell us about what worked. What was your question? What data were you working with? What was your methodology? What tools did you use for this phase of the process, and why, and how did it go? And so we have those in every chapter, except I think the last one. And it was amazing to see the growth in the development from 5 or 6 years ago when we were doing the first edition, in terms of how people are so creatively using all sorts of stuff that people were just starting to think about 6 years ago. So for example, the one that we have up here by Dr. Fassbender, he does work with Instagram. And so he writes about how he used InVivo's InCapture tool to be able to incorporate some images and collect that data and do that analysis in a very specific way. So it's one thing to say, hey, InCapture can do this. It's another to have a researcher actually tell you how they did it and how they went through that process.
Right.
and I would say that's an example of sort of digital tools, even though because encapture is sort of a research tool, in vivo is a research tool. And then the second screenshot example I think we have there
So
is
just
Diane.
for viewers who are not familiar with encapture, this is part of the in vivo data analysis package that is a little browser icon you can, put into your browser and then download, whole streams of hashtags or websites or whatever, directly into your data analysis software. So, it is a really amazing feature.
Yes, it is. And then Reddit would be an example of a digital space that, it's been around for a long time, but it's only been in the past couple of years that I've had a lot of students who are active in Reddit, know about Reddit, and want to do research in Reddit. And so Diane Lee actually did a sort of, she looked at what we would call the naturally occurring data conversations in Reddit, but she also had her students, art education students, create some participatory art-based interventions in Reddit in collaboration with the Reddit moderator and the forum. And so we had her kind of write about, both the challenges in doing that, but also just thinking of Reddit as a data source. How would you design that study? And so we wanted to include that as an example of the digital space and how people are using that.
I agree. This kind of thing to me is an incredibly valuable feature. As I say, not only for students, but for people who may be experienced researchers, but haven't done this kind of research. Because when you read a research article, I mean, a lot of times, like, I'll read a research article and I'm like, well, how'd you do that? Like, how'd that work out? I mean, was it like, did this work on the first try, or, did you have to like think this through? And I have on numerous occasions written to the authors of research articles and said, well, because they'll be talking about something, they did interviews, we're like, well, did you do the interviews online, or, did you just have group of people that you interviewed face to face about their participation online? Like, how did you do this? And, how did you navigate the choices that you had to make? And so, I really think it's valuable for people to be able to kind of go behind the scenes and see some of those steps. And so then you have this, so this was the person who gave you some other insights.
Yes. So there's not necessarily like the right, like, so it's hard to kind of continuing the conversation around theorizing technology and creating a unique digital workflow and being sort of overwhelmed by all of the choices that we have. And knowing that while method sections, like you were saying, end up looking neat and tidy, there's a lot of messiness behind the scenes. And so Adams and Thompson, when we ran across this book, they were kind of critical of our initial approach to sort of neutralizing technology's impact. And we really learned a lot about complexifying and actively being reflexive about the consequences and the trade-offs of any tool, that the tools change us as much as we might change the tool. And it's not just a one-way street. And so we try to, at the end of each chapter, include some really active, reflexive questions that help show that complexity.
Well, I hope that viewers who have a chance to get your book when it comes out will see those questions as being not just kind of the usual, throwaway discussion questions at the end of a chapter, but something that will really allow you to think more deeply about the topic.
That's what we're hoping.
So, and just looking at the, what I can see of the book as it's emerging, I wondered if you could, talk a little bit about your chapter 5 and chapter 6 and kind of compare and contrast the ways that someone would generate data.
Yeah, so chapter 5, I believe, is the digital tools. And then chapter 6 goes into the digital spaces. So we
Mm-hmm.
did end up keeping those as two separate chapters, whereas
Mm-hmm.
I think last time we had called them the researcher generated data and
Mm-hmm.
the pre-existing or naturally occurring
Mm-hmm.
data. And it's, it was hard to actually make those distinct as
Mm-hmm.
things are starting to morph and evolve. Like, like email used to be asynchronous, and that's becoming synchronous as we have mobile devices, right? Like everything is sort of morphing as technology develops. So it was hard, like observations we tend to think of as naturally occurring if you're out kind of on the public square, which nobody really is right now. But when you talk about
Mm-hmm.
going into a virtual space and observe, in some ways, yes, that activity is going on, and you might even be more invisible online, but it starts to get a little fuzzy because you are going in as the researcher. You're
Mm-hmm.
having to log in. The community may or may not want you there if they knew that you were a researcher, versus it being this kind of neutral thing. I'm trying to think, and Jessica, maybe you can remember some other examples of types of data that we had a hard time sort of separating out between the digital tool and the digital space because of some of that convergence.
I think observations was kind of the classic example, and it's also an example that has always come up as pointing to the kind of not clear distinction that can be made between naturally occurring data and researcher generated data. I mean, that's where it starts to morph, and you see it more as it's a useful heuristic to separate out data types, but by no means is even the way we structured 5
Mm-hmm.
and 6 meant to suggest that there's clear lines that divide data types. For many of the reasons Trina just mentioned, there's a lot
Mm-hmm.
of kind of fluidity across those types. But I
Right.
know in my own teaching that I do find it really helpful for students to offer them some kind of way to organize how they think about data types. And that's one of
Mm-hmm.
the things that we're hoping those two chapters do for
Mm-hmm.
readers, is really help them think about what are the range of data that I could engage with, and how might I think about them as
Right.
distinct.
Right. Well, I guess, in my thinking, where the dividing line comes between that sort of extant that you would call the data in the naturally occurring data that are in digital spaces, and the elicited or enacted where you have actual participants, is the question of informed consent. That if you're in those spaces, if you come in and you're looking around, but then you start posting and saying, well, how do you feel about flexible work? Well, now you've put yourself into it, and if people are answering and you want to use what they're saying, at, at some point you're going to need to think about research ethics questions. And so to me, so it's not a dividing line in terms of the technologies, which are constantly changing, but or just the way we're using them is changing or whatever, because we've got, you say, mobile devices that allow us to be more immediate. But the presence of people we would we're quoting, or somehow soliciting data from, that once we've got into that, then you need to have informed consent. And to me, that's the dividing line. Is that something that you talk about in yours?
Yeah, we do. We do talk a bit. So we try to weave ethics in to some extent in each chapter and
Mm-hmm.
just kind of pose some of the key questions. And that's always a huge one with digital spaces. And actually one that's can be useful, because unless it's an online community that you have some control over as the researcher, an online class, an online
Mm-hmm.
medical interaction, you can get informed consent. It's really, and in fact, you probably won't even be able to get access to that data because there's a gatekeeper who
Right.
will let you in or not to do research or
Right.
not. And so that's a little more clear cut. And that, yet also a digital, a digital space. But then digital spaces like Reddit or like an online support group, for people who are grieving, which I've looked at before. There's a lot of online support groups with people with a wide variety of medical conditions, as well as online hobby groups. There, it becomes trickier because you may have no way of getting informed consent, even if you wanted it, because they're not there under their real identities, and there may be no way to contact them. And so that's where observing as opposed to interacting with becomes sort of an easier solution, where they don't even know that you're basically just reading the archived text from a research perspective. But it becomes harder, but it's still essential if you're going to interact with them to get informed consent, but might almost be impossible given the nature of the discussion, and so, or the nature of how people interact online. And so absolutely, it's still a thorny thing to sort through. And the Association of Internet Researchers, of course, have been dealing with this for years, and they have their third edition of their ethical guidelines are online now, which we have sort of drawn upon and always send people to for a very long laundry list of all of the things that they have to, that we should be thinking about when it comes to these issues, for sure.
Right. It's a tricky area, and for sure, but one that I think is, increasingly important with the kind of more attention to issues about data privacy. And also, if you're a researcher doing global research involving, you have to recognize that we're much looser in the United States than in other countries. So there are a lot of things to consider around that, and that could be a completely another conversation. But I'm glad to hear that you're touching on that in your book. So I guess for researchers who are watching this and thinking about how they might proceed, what advice do you have, just as a place to start? And what else would you like to share about your forthcoming book?
Yeah, I think at least for me, one of the greatest starting points has always been turning back to the students that I teach. I know that Trena and I've talked a lot about when we write the book that our students are informing even some of the questions that we engage. So just thinking back to this last conversation, the thorny ethical issues that I often encounter are when students, for instance, say, is a public Instagram site open for me? IRB ethics board says it is, but is it? So anyway, all that to say, I know for me as an instructor, one of the most kind of instructive places is to turn to students and really learn from them. And I know my own understandings of technology have really been forwarded by them. I think there's other great sources from conversations that are unfolding on Twitter. You can learn a great deal there, as well as Sage MethodSpace. I mean, this is a place that there's some lively conversation happening. But then also, I think that one of the things that we try to emphasize in the book as a good starting place is something that we didn't do in our first book that we wrote, which is making sure that we continue to turn back to not just thinking about how can I learn about a bunch of digital tools, but how can I stop, be a critical appraiser of those tools, and really think about the theoretical and methodological implications of engaging with them. So throughout the book, one of the things that we emphasize, and I know we both do this with our students as well, is really not taking a kind of idealistic Pollyanna approach to digital tools. They're here, they're going to revolutionize my qualitative research practice, but rather to take a critical appraisal approach and to really think about the kind of the interconnectedness with the kind of research study that you're hoping to engage with as a first step. Trena, do you have other resources?
Yeah, so I think in terms of where to start, we've often talked about start with where the problem is in your own process. Like if you already have a great research process that works fine, until COVID hit, you probably didn't need to think about digital tools. But now, because we're being presented with serious challenges to how we're going to do our work, that's where people have to start, whether that's recruiting participants, to conducting interviews, to no longer being able to go to the physical library and need to figure out how to get resources. There's all sorts of like real problem points that technology can hopefully be a solution, because I've always seen technology as a solution to a problem. And what I've learned is it always has unintended consequences. So we have to be aware of the trade-offs of what it's going to gain us, that it might solve that problem, but it might create other ones, and trying to get out ahead of that a little bit. But yeah, I think if ever there was a time where people are starting to see why they need them and where the best place is to start, it would be now, unfortunately.
Right. Well, and whatever happens, hopefully we will get past this pandemic at some point. But it's unlikely that things are going to revert to whatever it was they were before. And so, really being able to look at not just kind of, well, here's a tool, here's a space, I'll use it, but to look at all of these, methodological implications and ethical implications, and really think those through. It seems like your book will be very helpful to people who are experiencing that. Is there anything else that you want to say before we close?
Yes, thank you for the invitation, and we're looking forward to seeing the next edition of your book as well.
Yes, so am I. It's in progress, almost done. So
fantastic.
Okay.